It started with a laugh, not the kind of laugh that signals joy or shared understanding, but the dismissive, contemptuous chuckle of someone who genuinely believes they are untouchable, beyond accountability, protected by the very institutions they claim to challenge. Representative Jasmine Crockett sat at the witness table in the House Judiciary Committee hearing room, her designer suit catching the harsh overhead lighting in a way that made it clear she had dressed not for serious legislative work, but for the cameras that she knew would capture every moment, every gesture, every perfectly crafted soundbite. She had just finished her opening statement, a fiery denunciation of what she characterized as Republican attempts to weaponize law enforcement against progressive voices. And she was riding high on the energy of supportive tweets already flooding her phone, already being read aloud by staffers who surrounded her like courtiers attending royalty. What Jasmine Crockett didn't anticipate, what her bubble of sycophants and media allies had failed to prepare her for, was that sitting across from her was not another politician looking to trade barbs for cable news clips. Sitting across from her, with the calm intensity of a man who had spent his entire career in the shadows of national security, was Kash Patel, the newly appointed FBI director who had walked into that hearing room not to defend his agency, but to prosecute the lies, the hypocrisy, and the dangerous ideology that had infected American politics like a virus. For the next hour, Jasmine Crockett would learn a brutal lesson about the difference between viral moments and actual substance, between performing for social media and answering to facts, between building a brand on righteous indignation and facing someone who had receipts for every claim she had ever made. The House Judiciary Committee hearing room on December 12, 2025, was packed beyond its official capacity, bodies pressed into every available space, the air thick with anticipation and that particular electric tension that precedes moments that will be remembered, replayed, and analyzed for years to come. This was technically a routine oversight hearing, the kind of bureaucratic exercise that Congress conducts with numbing regularity to create the appearance of accountability without the substance of actual consequences. The stated purpose was to discuss FBI priorities under new leadership, a dry policy matter that would normally attract maybe a dozen reporters and a handful of policy wonks who actually cared about the minutiae of federal law enforcement. But everyone in Washington knew this hearing was about something far more significant, far more personal, far more explosive than budget allocations and organizational charts. This was about the collision of two completely incompatible worldviews, two fundamentally opposed visions of what America should be, embodied in two people who represented everything the other side claimed to oppose. On one side of the table sat Representative Jasmine Crockett, 38 years old, a civil rights attorney turned progressive firebrand who had catapulted to national prominence, not through legislative accomplishments, but through viral moments, social media savvy, and an uncanny ability to turn every policy disagreement into a performance of oppression, every criticism into evidence of systemic racism, every question into an attack on her identity. She had become, in just 2 years in Congress, the face of a certain kind of progressive politics that valued emotional authenticity over empirical accuracy, that saw every issue through the lens of identity and power, that believed the system was so fundamentally corrupt that the only proper response was to burn it down and rebuild from ashes. On the other side sat Kash Patel, 45 years old, son of Indian immigrants who had built successful careers through hard work and education, a man who had served as a federal prosecutor, worked in counterterrorism, advised presidents, and now found himself at the helm of the most powerful law enforcement agency in the world. Patel carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen actual evil, who had dealt with real threats to American security, who understood that words had consequences beyond trending hashtags, and that governance required more than righteous anger and clever comebacks. He wore a dark suit that looked expensive but not ostentatious, his tie perfectly knotted, his expression neutral in a way that somehow made him more intimidating than if he had been scowling. He had brought with him not just the usual briefing materials but something more damaging, more comprehensive, more devastating. A complete dossier on Jasmine Crockett's record. Her statements, her votes, her hypocrisy, compiled over months by investigators who had been waiting for exactly this moment to present it all at once in a forum she couldn't escape. Chairman Jim Jordan of Ohio called the hearing to order with 3 sharp raps of his gavel, the sound cutting through the ambient noise like a gunshot. Jordan looked tired, which was understandable given that he had spent the better part of 2 years fighting against weaponization of federal agencies, against political persecution disguised as law enforcement, against the systematic abuse of power by institutions that were supposed to serve all Americans but had become tools of partisan warfare. Director Patel, Jordan began, his Ohio accent carrying through the microphone system. Welcome to your first oversight hearing as FBI Director. We appreciate your willingness to appear before this committee and answer questions about the Bureau's priorities and operations. Patel nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than deference. Thank you, Chairman Jordan. I'm honored to be here and ready to discuss how we're rebuilding trust in the FBI and refocusing our mission on protecting all Americans, not just those who hold the right political views. The opening shot had been fired. The implicit criticism of the previous FBI leadership, the suggestion that the Bureau had been politicized, the promise of reform, all of it packaged in a single sentence that immediately drew a reaction from the Democratic side of the committee. Representative Crockett, who was not actually a member of the Judiciary Committee, but had been invited to participate as a special witness due to her national profile and her vocal criticism of law enforcement, leaned forward toward her microphone with an expression that combined indignation and barely suppressed glee. She had been waiting for this moment, had prepared her lines, had workshopped her delivery with communications staffers who specialized in creating viral content. Mr. Patel, she began, her voice carrying that particular tone of wounded righteousness that she had perfected over hundreds of television appearances. I find it deeply disturbing that the person now leading the FBI is someone who has spent years attacking our intelligence and law enforcement communities, someone who has spread conspiracy theories about the deep state, someone who has made a career out of undermining the very institutions he now claims to lead. You talk about rebuilding trust, but how can anyone trust someone with your history of partisan hackery to lead an agency that's supposed to be above politics? The progressive gallery erupted in applause, phones already raised to capture Crockett's moment of confrontation, already preparing to tweet clips with captions like "Crockett destroys new FBI director," and "Watch Jasmine Crockett speak truth to power." This was the moment they had come for. Their champion calling out what they saw as the worst of Trump-era corruption, refusing to let a political appointee escape scrutiny. Patel waited for the applause to die down, his expression unchanged, giving no indication that the personal attack had landed or even registered. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, measured, the tone of someone explaining basic facts to a confused student rather than defending himself against accusations. Representative Crockett, I appreciate your concerns. Let me address them directly. My criticism of the FBI has never been about the institution itself or the thousands of dedicated agents who do heroic work every day. My criticism has been about leadership that allowed the Bureau to be weaponized for political purposes, that used surveillance powers against American citizens without proper justification, that lied to FISA courts to obtain warrants, that pursued investigations based on political opposition research rather than actual evidence of crimes. These aren't conspiracy theories. These are documented facts acknowledged even by people who disagreed with how I characterized them. But since you've raised questions about trust and about history, perhaps we should examine both. He reached for a folder on the table in front of him, a thick manila envelope that seemed to grow larger and more ominous as he slowly opened it. Since you've questioned my fitness to lead the FBI based on my past statements and actions, I think it's only fair that we examine your record as well. Your statements, your actions, your positions on law enforcement and public safety. Because Representative Crockett, if we're going to have a conversation about who can be trusted with power, we need to look at how you've used the power you have. The room went quiet. Even Crockett's supporters sensed something shifting. some trap being set that they couldn't quite identify but knew was coming. Crockett herself maintained her confident expression, but her hands, visible above the table, had stopped gesturing and now gripped the edge of the witness table with slightly more force than seemed necessary. Let's start with something recent, Patel continued, pulling the first document from his folder with the precision of a surgeon selecting an instrument. 3 weeks ago, there was an incident in your district, a series of arsons targeting car dealerships, specifically Tesla dealerships. The investigation is ongoing, but we have strong evidence suggesting these were coordinated attacks motivated by anti-corporate ideology and racial resentment toward businesses perceived as serving wealthy, predominantly white customers. 5 dealerships burned, millions in property damage, dozens of jobs lost, people's livelihoods destroyed. And do you know what you said when asked about it during a town hall? He pulled out a printed transcript, highlighted in yellow. You said, and I quote, "A Tesla burning down sounds like white people's problems to me." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Even Democrats on the committee shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't a gotcha based on something taken out of context. This was a direct quote, captured on video, spread across social media by Crockett's own supporters who had thought it was a moment of bold truth-telling rather than a confession of callous disregard for victims of serious crimes. Representative Crockett, Patel continued, his voice taking on a harder edge. Federal investigators were on the ground at those crime scenes. We had evidence of accelerants, of coordinated timing, of social media posts celebrating the destruction. And while we were interviewing traumatized employees who watched their workplace burn, while we were trying to determine if anyone had been injured or killed, you were making jokes about it being a white people's problem. Tell me, at what point did arson become less serious based on the perceived race of the victims? At what point did federal crimes become something to laugh about because the targets didn't fit your approved demographic categories? Crockett leaned into her microphone, her expression shifting from confident to defensive in an instant. Director Patel, you're taking my words completely out of context. What I was addressing was the disparity in response. The fact that when Black-owned businesses in my community face crime and violence, we don't see the same level of federal resources, the same media attention, the same urgency. I was pointing out a double standard, not dismissing arson. Patel didn't blink, didn't pause, didn't give her room to breathe. Congresswoman, I have the full video. Would you like me to play it? The context doesn't help you. You weren't making a sophisticated point about resource allocation. You were laughing, getting applause from your audience, treating the destruction of people's livelihoods as entertainment because the victims were the wrong color. And if anyone from the other party had said that a Black-owned business burning was just Black people's problems, this committee would have immediately called for their resignation, their censure, their removal from office. But when you say it, when you racialize crime victims, when you dismiss arson based on the perceived demographic of those affected, somehow that's speaking truth to power. That's the double standard, Representative Crockett. And it's not just offensive, it's dangerous. He pulled another document from his folder, this one a series of social media screenshots arranged chronologically. But let's continue examining your record on public safety and law enforcement, since you've positioned yourself as an expert on these topics. Over the past 2 years, you've voted against every single law enforcement funding bill that's come before the House. Every single one. You voted against funding for police body cameras, which you claim would increase accountability. You voted against funding for de-escalation training, which you say police desperately need. You voted against funding for community policing initiatives, which you argue should be the model for reform. You voted against all of it while simultaneously demanding that police be better trained, better equipped, and better supervised. Patel spread the voting records across the table in front of him, each one marked with a bright red opposed stamp next to Crockett's name. How exactly do you expect police departments to implement the reforms you demand when you vote to deny them the resources to do so? Unless, of course, the point isn't actually reform. Unless the point is to ensure that reform fails so you can continue to have something to campaign against, something to build your brand around, something to generate viral moments from. The progressive gallery had gone silent. the triumphant energy from minutes before replaced by a growing unease. This wasn't going according to the script they had expected. Crockett wasn't destroying Patel. Patel was systematically dismantling her entire political identity with documented evidence that couldn't be explained away with appeals to systemic oppression or clever wordplay. Crockett's response came quickly, her voice rising in volume and intensity as she fell back on the rhetorical tactics that had always served her well in the past. Director Patel, those bills you're citing were vehicles for increased militarization of police, for funding equipment and tactics that have been used to brutalize black and brown communities for generations. I voted against them because they would have made the problem worse, not better. You're trying to paint me as anti-police when I'm actually pro-community, pro-accountability, pro-reform. Patel smiled, but it wasn't a warm expression. It was the smile of someone who had anticipated exactly this response and had prepared the perfect counterargument. Let's test that claim, shall we? He pulled out another thick stack of documents, these ones marked with official FBI letterhead and evidence tags. These are crime statistics from your district over the past 2 years. The period since you took office. Homicides are up 37%. Carjackings have increased by 62%. Armed robberies up 53%. Assaults with deadly weapons up 41%. These aren't national statistics. These aren't Republican talking points. These are FBI uniform crime reports compiled from data submitted by local law enforcement in your district. He looked up at Crockett, his expression hardening into something resembling genuine anger for the first time. While you've been building your national brand by attacking police, by voting against law enforcement funding, by making jokes about businesses burning, the people in your district, the black and brown communities you claim to represent, have been suffering through a crime wave that is destroying their neighborhoods, their businesses, their sense of safety. He pulled out photographs, crime scene images that the committee chairman had pre-approved for display, images that showed the aftermath of violence in ways that statistics couldn't capture. This is Mrs. Yolanda Washington, age 73, a retired schoolteacher who lived in your district for 46 years. She was murdered during a carjacking outside her church on a Sunday morning. Her killers were 14 and 16 years old, teenagers who had been arrested multiple times before but kept being released because the progressive prosecutor you endorsed ran on a platform of diversion and rehabilitation over incarceration. Mrs. Washington's family asked to meet with you 4 times after her death. You never responded. You were too busy filming TikTok videos about police brutality. The image remained on the screen behind Patel, an elderly black woman's face smiling in what was clearly a family photograph. A life full of dignity and service ended by violence that might have been prevented if the criminals who killed her had faced consequences for their previous offenses. Patel wasn't finished. This is Marcus Henderson, age 17, shot in a drive-by shooting while walking home from his part-time job at a grocery store. He survived but is now paralyzed from the waist down. His mother wrote to your office 6 times asking for help navigating victim services, asking for assistance dealing with medical bills, asking if you could do anything to help her son. You never responded, but you had time to appear on The View to discuss police reform. He pulled out another photograph. This is the Rodriguez family. Father, mother, 2 children ages 8 and 11. Their small business, a corner grocery store that had been in their family for 3 generations, was robbed at gunpoint 5 times in 6 months. After the 5th robbery, they closed permanently. Couldn't afford the insurance premiums anymore, couldn't risk their lives anymore. They asked your office for help, for advocacy with city officials, for support in accessing small business recovery programs. You never responded, but you found time to attend a gala in Manhattan, where you gave a speech about economic justice and took pictures with celebrities. Patel's voice rose now, his calm, professional demeanor giving way to something more passionate, more personal. You talk about being pro-community, Representative Crockett, but which community? Because it's certainly not the community of crime victims in your district who can't get their congresswoman to return a phone call. It's not the community of small business owners who have been driven out by crime and can't get any support from your office. It's not the community of mothers who have lost children to violence and desperately need someone in power to care about their grief. The only community you're pro is the community of progressive activists and media personalities who amplify your viral moments and build your national brand. The silence in the hearing room was total now. Even the usual sounds of shuffling papers and whispered conversations among staffers had ceased. Every eye was on Crockett, waiting to see how she would respond to this onslaught of documented evidence of her failures. Her face had gone through a series of transformations over the past several minutes, from confident to defensive to angry, and now settled into something that looked almost like panic as she realized that her usual rhetorical tactics weren't going to work against someone who had come prepared with specific names, specific cases, specific evidence of harm caused by her negligence. "But let's continue, because we're just getting started," Patel said, returning to his folder and pulling out what appeared to be financial documents. "Since you've positioned yourself as a champion of working people fighting against corruption, let's examine your finances. When you entered Congress 2 years ago, your financial disclosure showed a net worth of approximately $65,000 and student loan debt of about $80,000. A fairly typical financial situation for someone in their mid-30s with a law degree. Your most recent financial disclosure, filed 6 months ago, shows a net worth of approximately $4 million. $4 million accumulated in less than 2 years on a government salary of $174,000 per year. Even if you hadn't spent a single penny on living expenses, hadn't paid any taxes, saved every dollar of your salary, you would have accumulated $348,000, not $4 million. So where did the other $3.6 million come from?" He spread the financial disclosures across the table, the numbers highlighted in fluorescent yellow that seemed to glow under the harsh hearing room lights. "Book deal. $1.2 million advance for a memoir about your first year in Congress. Interesting that you got paid more than most best-selling authors get paid for a book written by someone with 1 year of experience. Netflix documentary, $850,000 for a behind-the-scenes look at your life as a congresswoman. Podcast deal, $600,000 from Spotify for a show that released 12 episodes and was canceled due to poor listenership. Speaking fees, averaging $75,000 per appearance. You've given 32 paid speeches in the past 18 months while Congress has been in session, meaning you've been flying around the country collecting speaking fees instead of being in Washington doing the job your constituents elected you to do." Patel looked up from the documents, his expression one of undisguised contempt. "You've monetized being Jasmine Crockett, the brand, the social media phenomenon, the progressive firebrand. You've gotten rich not from serving your community but from performing for cameras, from generating viral content, from building a national profile that you can cash in on. You've become a multimillionaire in 2 years by doing everything except the actual work of legislating." He pulled out another document, this one appearing to be campaign finance records. "And let's talk about your campaign spending, because that's where things get really interesting. Your campaign has paid over $2 million to a consulting firm called Crockett Strategies, LLC. The sole owner and operator of Crockett Strategies is your brother, Michael Crockett, who has no background in political consulting, no track record of successful campaigns, no visible work product that anyone can identify. $2 million in campaign funds paid to your brother's company for consulting services that appear to consist primarily of him cashing checks." Patel pulled out bank records, transactions highlighted and annotated. But it gets better. Crockett Strategies then subcontracted much of the supposed work to other firms, taking a 25% fee off the top for doing nothing except serving as a pass-through entity. Your brother made $500,000 just by having his name on a company that funneled money from your campaign to other vendors. That's not consulting. That's a kickback scheme. That's using campaign contributions as a family enrichment program. That's exactly the kind of corruption that you claim to be fighting against, except when you do it, it's somehow different. The progressive section of the gallery had begun to empty, supporters quietly gathering their belongings and slipping out of the hearing room, unable to reconcile the person they thought they knew with the documented evidence of corruption and hypocrisy being presented. Those who remained looked shell-shocked, their phones now lowered, no longer filming content that was supposed to show their champion destroying a Trump appointee, but instead documenting her systematic destruction by someone who had come prepared with receipts for every accusation. Crockett tried to interrupt, her voice lacking its earlier confidence. Director Patel, these are standard campaign expenditures reviewed by lawyers and disclosed according to federal law. You're trying to criminalize normal political activity because you disagree with my politics. This is exactly the kind of weaponization of law enforcement that I was warning about. Patel didn't let her finish, his response immediate and cutting. Congresswoman, I'm not trying to criminalize anything. I'm simply reading from your public financial disclosures and campaign reports. These are your own documents, your own numbers. And if these expenditures were reviewed by lawyers and found to be legal, then perhaps the problem is with campaign finance laws that allow members of Congress to funnel millions of dollars to family members for undefined services. But don't accuse me of weaponization when all I'm doing is reading your own disclosures out loud. He gathered the financial documents and set them aside, reaching for another section of his folder. But let's move beyond the personal corruption and discuss your legislative record, because that's really what we should be evaluating. You've been in Congress for 2 years. How many bills have you authored that became law? Crockett hesitated, clearly knowing where this was going but unable to avoid answering. I've introduced numerous pieces of legislation addressing police reform, economic justice, climate change. The fact that they haven't passed yet doesn't diminish their importance. 0, Patel said flatly. The answer is 0. You've successfully passed exactly 0 bills into law, not police reform, not economic justice, not climate change, nothing. You've introduced bills that were designed to generate headlines rather than actually pass. Messaging bills that your own leadership never intended to bring to the floor for a vote, because they knew the bills were unworkable, unconstitutional, or politically toxic. You've spent 2 years generating viral content while accomplishing absolutely nothing in terms of actual legislation. He pulled out a comparison chart showing legislative accomplishments of various members of Congress. Here are some of your colleagues, both Democrats and Republicans, who were elected in the same year as you. Representative Smith from Pennsylvania, 14 bills signed into law, mostly focused on infrastructure and economic development in his district. Representative Johnson from Michigan, 9 bills signed into law, focused on Great Lakes environmental protection. Representative Martinez from Texas, 12 bills signed into law, focused on border security and immigration processing improvements. These are people who actually did the work of legislating, who compromised, who built coalitions, who crafted bills that could actually pass and become law and help their constituents. And then there's you, with 0 legislative accomplishments but $4 million in personal wealth accumulated from being famous. Patel leaned forward, his voice dropping to a tone that was somehow more intimidating than when he had been speaking loudly. So let me ask you directly, Representative Crockett, what have you actually accomplished for your constituents? Not what have you tweeted about, not what viral moments have you created, not what television appearances have you made. What have you actually done to improve the lives of the people who elected you to represent them in Congress? The question hung in the air like an indictment that demanded an answer. Crockett opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out immediately. She was clearly running through her mental database of accomplishments, trying to find something substantive to point to, some bill or initiative or constituent service that would demonstrate actual effectiveness. The silence stretched on, 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15 seconds of dead air that felt like an eternity in a hearing room full of cameras capturing every moment. Finally, Crockett found her voice, but it lacked the confidence and righteous anger that had characterized her earlier statements. I've been a voice for marginalized communities in Congress. I've used my platform to highlight issues that would otherwise be ignored. I've brought attention to police brutality, to economic inequality, to systemic racism. That kind of advocacy is valuable even if it doesn't result in immediate legislative wins. Patel nodded slowly, as if he had expected exactly that answer and found it completely inadequate. A voice, a platform, attention. These are the words people use when they have no actual accomplishments to point to. You're essentially admitting that your value as a member of Congress is limited to talking, to performing, to generating media coverage. Meanwhile, people in your district are dying from crime you could have helped prevent if you'd voted to fund police, instead of opposing every law enforcement bill. Businesses are closing because you're too busy being famous to help them navigate federal programs. Families are suffering because you don't respond to their requests for constituent services, because you're too busy collecting speaking fees and filming content for your social media channels. He pulled out a final document, this one appearing to be a petition. This is a petition signed by over 15,000 residents of your district calling for your resignation. 15,000 of your own constituents who are so frustrated with your performance, so disappointed by your failures, so angry at being ignored and neglected, that they've formally asked you to step down. When was the last time you held a town hall in your district where you actually took questions from constituents instead of just delivering a prepared speech? When was the last time you sat down with community leaders to discuss their concerns instead of flying to another paid speaking engagement? Crockett's face had gone through another transformation, the panic now giving way to a kind of desperate defiance. She straightened in her chair, pushed her shoulders back, and when she spoke her voice carried an edge of anger that seemed directed as much at Patel as at the situation she found herself in. Director Patel, everything you've presented here today is a coordinated attack designed to silence a black woman in Congress who refuses to stay quiet, who refuses to accept the status quo, who demands justice and accountability from systems that have oppressed my community for generations. You're using your position to engage in exactly the kind of political persecution that I've been warning about. This is what happens when someone challenges power in America. They bring out everything they can find, take it out of context, weaponize it, and try to destroy your credibility because they can't defeat your arguments. Patel let her finish, didn't interrupt, gave her the space to make her defense. Then he responded with a calmness that was somehow more devastating than anger would have been. Congresswoman, I haven't taken anything out of context. I've presented your voting record, your financial disclosures, your public statements, all available from official sources. I haven't speculated about your motives or questioned your identity. I've simply held you to the same standard that you demand everyone else be held to. And instead of defending your record, instead of explaining your votes or your finances or your failures, you're hiding behind claims of persecution and accusations of racism. He stood up slowly, gathering his materials with deliberate precision. Let me be very clear about something. I don't care what your race is. I don't care what your gender is. I don't care about your identity or your politics or your social media following. I care about whether you're doing your job, whether you're serving your constituents, whether you're upholding your oath of office. And based on the evidence, based on the facts, based on your own record, you're failing on all counts. You've enriched yourself while your district suffers. You've built a national brand while ignoring local needs. You've voted against law enforcement funding while crime devastates your communities. You've funneled campaign money to your family while claiming to fight corruption. You've accomplished nothing legislatively while collecting millions in speaking fees and media deals. That's not persecution, Congresswoman. That's accountability. Patel placed his folder back in his briefcase, the sound of the clasp closing echoing in the silent chamber. And one more thing, since you've accused me of weaponizing my position for political purposes. The FBI is currently investigating several matters related to campaign finance violations by members of Congress. I won't comment on specific ongoing investigations, but I will say that anyone who has used campaign funds improperly, who has failed to properly disclose financial relationships, who has engaged in schemes to enrich family members through campaign expenditures, they should be very concerned about what we might find. Because unlike previous FBI leadership that gave special treatment to politically connected individuals, I believe in equal justice under law. And that means everyone gets investigated with the same thoroughness, everyone gets prosecuted with the same standards, Everyone faces the same consequences for breaking the law, regardless of their party, their race, their gender, or their social media following. The implications of that statement hit the room like a physical force. Patel wasn't just criticizing Crockett's record. He was implying that she might be under federal investigation for campaign finance violations. Crockett's face went pale, the defiance draining away as she processed what had just been said. Her attorneys, sitting in the row behind her, were frantically whispering to each other, clearly alarmed by the direction this had taken. The few remaining progressive supporters in the gallery sat frozen, unable to tweet or film or celebrate because there was nothing to celebrate, only the ruins of their champion's credibility scattered across the witness table. Chairman Jordan, recognizing that the hearing had accomplished everything it needed to accomplish and possibly more than he had anticipated, moved quickly to conclude. "Thank you, Director Patel, for your testimony and for your candor. I think this has been a very illuminating discussion about accountability and about the importance of holding everyone to the same standards regardless of their political affiliation. This hearing is adjourned." The gavel came down with finality, and the room erupted into chaos. Reporters rushed toward the exits, phones pressed to their ears, already filing stories about what would be the dominant political news for the next week. Crockett sat motionless for a long moment, her carefully constructed public persona shattered, her brand as a fearless progressive warrior destroyed by someone who had simply read her own record back to her and asked her to defend it. The media response to what became known simply as the Patel takedown began within minutes and built to a crescendo that consumed the entire political news cycle for days. Conservative outlets predictably celebrated it as complete vindication of their criticisms of progressive politicians who talk about justice while enriching themselves. Fox News ran extended segments analyzing every aspect of Patel's testimony, bringing in financial experts to verify the numbers he had cited, former FBI agents to discuss the implications of his comments about ongoing investigations, political analysts to discuss what this meant for the broader progressive movement. The Daily Caller and the Federalist published comprehensive breakdowns of Crockett's financial disclosures, campaign expenditures, and legislative record, confirming every fact that Patel had presented. But the more significant coverage came from sources that had previously been either neutral toward or supportive of Crockett. The Washington Post, which had written several favorable profiles of her as a rising progressive star, now assigned investigative reporters to examine the payments to her brother's consulting firm. Their findings, published 4 days after the hearing, were damning. The reporters could find no evidence that Crockett's strategies had produced any work product justifying the $2 million in payments. They interviewed other political consultants who confirmed that the fees charged were wildly excessive for the services supposedly provided. They documented that much of the work had been subcontracted to other firms, while Michael Crockett's company took a substantial cut without adding any value. The article stopped short of directly accusing Crockett of illegal activity, but the implication was clear. This was at minimum an ethical violation and possibly a criminal scheme to enrich family members using campaign funds. The New York Times, another outlet that had given Crockett generally favorable coverage, published an investigation into her constituent services, or lack thereof. Times reporters obtained response time data from Crockett's office through Freedom of Information requests and compared it to other members of Congress. The findings confirmed what Patel had stated. Crockett's office had one of the worst constituent response rates in the entire House of Representatives, averaging 6 to 8 weeks to respond to inquiries compared to a congressional average of 3 to 5 days. The Times interviewed dozens of constituents who had tried to get help from Crockett's office with veterans' benefits, immigration cases, small business assistance, and other federal services, and found story after story of people being ignored, calls not returned, emails unanswered, casework left unresolved. One particularly heartbreaking interview featured the mother of Marcus Henderson, the teenager who had been paralyzed in the drive-by shooting Patel had mentioned. The mother described writing to Crockett's office 6 times asking for help, getting no response, while she watched her congresswoman appear on national television multiple times during the same period. The article included a quote that would be repeated endlessly. "She has time for the View but no time for the people who elected her." Politico published a detailed analysis of Crockett's legislative record that was devastating in its thoroughness. The reporters examined every bill she had introduced, every amendment she had proposed, every vote she had cast, and found exactly what Patel had stated: zero legislative accomplishments. But the article went deeper, interviewing congressional staffers, committee members, and legislative experts who painted a picture of someone who was completely uninterested in the actual work of legislating. Multiple sources described Crockett as frequently absent from committee meetings, unprepared when she did attend, more focused on getting quotable sound bites than on understanding policy details or building coalitions for her proposals. One anonymous Democratic staffer was quoted saying, "She treats Congress like it's a reality TV show where she's the star. She doesn't understand that passing legislation requires compromise, relationship building, and actual work. She just wants moments that will go viral." The article noted that even other progressive members of Congress had privately expressed frustration with Crockett, feeling that her focus on performance over substance was damaging to their shared policy goals. But perhaps the most damaging coverage came from local news outlets in Crockett's own district. The Dallas Morning News, which had endorsed her in her initial campaign, published a scathing editorial titled, "Jasmine Crockett Has Failed Her Constituents." The editorial methodically documented the crime increases in her district, the businesses that had closed, the residents who couldn't get help from her office, the town halls she hadn't held, the community meetings she had skipped. The editorial concluded, "Representative Crockett promised to be a voice for the voiceless, but she has instead become a celebrity who uses her district as a backdrop for her national ambitions, while ignoring the very real problems facing the people who live here." Her constituents deserve better than a part-time congresswoman who is too busy being famous to do her job. Local television stations ran segments featuring interviews with residents who had tried to get help from Crockett's office and been ignored, with small business owners who felt abandoned, with crime victims who needed advocacy and got nothing. The portrait that emerged from local coverage was of a district that felt betrayed, of constituents who had believed in Crockett's promises of revolutionary change, but had instead gotten a congresswoman who was rarely present and never responsive. The financial scrutiny intensified when campaign finance watchdog organizations filed formal complaints with the Federal Election Commission regarding the payments to Michael Crockett's consulting firm. The complaints alleged that the payments constituted a scheme to convert campaign funds to personal use through a family member's company, a violation of federal campaign finance law that could result in criminal charges. The FEC announced it would investigate the matter, and shortly thereafter, reports emerged that the FBI was conducting its own investigation as part of a broader probe into campaign finance violations by multiple members of Congress. Crockett's legal team issued statements denying any wrongdoing and claiming that all payments had been properly disclosed and were for legitimate services, but they notably declined to provide any documentation of what services had been performed or what work product had been created. The payments to Crockett Strategies became emblematic of a broader problem with campaign finance: the ease with which politicians could enrich family members and associates by paying them enormous sums from campaign accounts with minimal oversight or accountability. Reform advocates used Crockett's case as Exhibit A in their arguments for stricter regulation of campaign expenditures and more aggressive enforcement of existing laws. The House Ethics Committee, facing intense public pressure and media scrutiny, announced it would open an investigation into Crockett's campaign finances and her failure to properly perform constituent services. The committee's announcement was carefully worded to avoid prejudging the outcome, but the mere fact that they were investigating was politically devastating. Ethics investigations often take months or years to complete, meaning that Crockett would be operating under a cloud of scandal for the foreseeable future, undermining her ability to be effective even in the performative aspects of her job that she had previously excelled at. Democratic leadership in the House tried to maintain a position of neutrality, issuing statements supporting due process, while privately expressing frustration that Crockett's problems were becoming a distraction from their policy agenda, and providing ammunition to Republicans who wanted to paint all Democrats as corrupt and out of touch. Some Democratic members, particularly those in competitive districts who worried about being associated with Crockett's scandals, began publicly calling for her to take a leave of absence from the Judiciary Committee pending the outcome of investigations, a rare intra-party rebuke that signaled how toxic she had become. The impact on Crockett's personal brand, the social media presence and national profile that had been her primary focus and her source of income, was immediate and severe. Her Twitter follower count began dropping precipitously as former supporters abandoned her, unable to reconcile the progressive champion they thought they knew with the documented evidence of corruption, hypocrisy, and negligence. The comments on her posts shifted from supportive to hostile, with even many progressive voices expressing disappointment and betrayal. Her Instagram, which had been a carefully curated feed of inspirational quotes, behind-the-scenes congressional content, and lifestyle posts designed to make her relatable to young followers, became a graveyard of critical comments. She attempted to post a video response to the Patel hearing, sitting in her congressional office, trying to frame the entire situation as a coordinated attack by Trump appointees and right-wing media. The video was her standard defensive playbook: position herself as a victim, invoke her identity as a black woman being targeted, claim that the accusations were politically motivated, promise to continue fighting for justice despite these attacks. But this time, the approach didn't work. The comment section filled immediately with people citing specific facts from Patel's testimony, asking specific questions about the payments to her brother, demanding specific answers about her legislative failures. Within 24 hours, she had deleted the video, an admission of defeat that only made the situation worse by suggesting she had no defense and couldn't handle even basic scrutiny. Her podcast, which had been a lucrative source of income even though listenership had been modest, was canceled by Spotify 3 weeks after the Patel hearing. The official statement cited mutual agreement to pursue other opportunities, but industry insiders reported that Spotify had been looking for an excuse to end the deal for months due to poor performance, and that Crockett's scandal provided the perfect cover. Her speaking invitations, which had been flowing in steadily and paying tens of thousands of dollars per appearance, dried up almost completely. Universities that had booked her for commencement addresses canceled, claiming schedule conflicts but clearly not wanting to associate their institutions with someone under investigation for corruption. Progressive organizations that had invited her to keynote their conferences quietly rescinded invitations or failed to follow up on preliminary discussions. Within 2 months of the Patel hearing, her speaking income had dropped from approximately $75,000 per month to zero, a financial hit that would make it much more difficult for her to maintain the lifestyle she had become accustomed to, while simultaneously facing mounting legal bills from the investigations into her conduct. The book deal that had paid her a $1.2 million advance became another source of controversy when it was revealed that her memoir had sold fewer than 8,000 copies despite the massive advance and despite her substantial social media following. Publishers typically expect books from celebrity politicians to sell tens of thousands of copies at minimum, and advances are calculated based on projected sales. The fact that Crockett's book had sold so poorly suggested that either the publisher had vastly overestimated her commercial appeal, or the large advance had been a form of disguised payment for access or influence. Book industry analysts began questioning whether the advance had been justified by any reasonable sales projections, or whether it had been a way to funnel money to a politically connected individual under the guise of a legitimate business transaction. The publisher, facing its own questions about the deal, began negotiating with Crockett's team about recouping some of the advance, adding another financial and legal complication to her mounting problems. The Netflix documentary about her life as a congresswoman, which had paid her $850,000, faced similar scrutiny when viewership numbers emerged showing that it had been one of the platform's least-watched political documentaries despite heavy promotion. Critics suggested that Netflix had paid for access to a rising political star, rather than for content that viewers actually wanted to watch. Another example of how Crockett had monetized her position through deals that didn't make commercial sense, unless understood as payments for influence rather than legitimate business transactions. The political consequences in her district were perhaps the most severe and most immediate. Within 3 weeks of the Patel hearing, 4 credible primary challengers had announced they would run against Crockett in the next Democratic primary. The challengers represented different factions within the district but shared a common message. Crockett had failed her constituents by prioritizing her national profile over local needs, by enriching herself while her district suffered, by being absent when her people needed her. One challenger, a longtime community organizer who had deep roots in the district, released a campaign announcement video that featured interviews with constituents who had been ignored by Crockett's office, small business owners who had closed their shops while she was giving paid speeches, families of crime victims who couldn't get their congresswoman to return their calls. The video's tagline was brutal in its simplicity. We need a representative who actually represents us, not someone who uses us as a backdrop for her celebrity. Polling conducted 6 weeks after the Patel hearing showed Crockett's approval rating in her own district had collapsed from 58% to 27%, a catastrophic drop that suggested her political career might not survive even if she avoided criminal charges. The coalition that had originally elected Crockett, a diverse group of young progressives, black voters, and traditional Democrats who had been attracted to her energy and her promises of change, began to fracture. Young progressives, who had been her most vocal supporters and had provided much of the volunteer energy for her campaigns, felt betrayed by the revelation that she had paid her brother millions while campaign volunteers worked for free. Black voters in her district, particularly older residents who were most affected by the crime wave, were angry that she had been absent and unresponsive while their neighborhoods became less safe. Traditional Democrats were frustrated that she had accomplished nothing legislatively and had made their party look bad with her scandals. Community leaders who had initially supported her began publicly calling for her resignation, arguing that the district deserved representation that wasn't distracted by investigations and scandals. Several prominent pastors who had endorsed her in previous campaigns issued a joint statement expressing disappointment in her failure to serve constituents and suggesting that she should seriously consider stepping down to allow someone else to do the job effectively. The broader progressive movement struggled with how to respond to Crockett's downfall. Some activists continued to defend her, arguing that she was being targeted because of her race and her willingness to challenge power, that the investigations were politically motivated, that the media coverage was disproportionate compared to scandals involving conservative politicians. But these defenses became increasingly isolated and increasingly desperate as more facts emerged confirming Patel's accusations. Other progressives recognized that defending Crockett was damaging to their credibility and their cause, that trying to shield her from accountability made them look hypocritical given their demands for accountability from others. A divide emerged within progressive circles between those who believed identity politics meant they had to defend any black woman under attack regardless of the evidence, and those who believed that progressive values required holding everyone accountable to the same standards regardless of their identity. Several prominent progressive commentators published pieces arguing that the left needed to acknowledge Crockett's failures and corruption, rather than defending her simply because she identified as progressive, that principles mattered more than tribal loyalty, that demanding accountability from conservatives while excusing identical behavior from progressives was intellectually and morally bankrupt. The comparison to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's downfall after her confrontation with Ben Shapiro was inevitable and instructive. Both had been young progressive women of color who had built national brands through social media and viral moments. Both had prioritized celebrity over legislation, performance over substance. Both had enriched themselves while claiming to fight for working people. Both had been exposed by conservative commentators who had simply presented documented facts about their records. Both had discovered that viral moments and social media followers were not sufficient foundations for actual political careers, that celebrity could be destroyed much more quickly than it could be built, that accountability eventually came for everyone regardless of how many Twitter followers they had or how many magazine covers they had appeared on. Political scientists began using Crockett and AOC as case studies in the dangers of celebrity politics. The way social media incentive structures corrupted governance by rewarding performance over policy. The fragility of political brands built on image rather than accomplishment. Kash Patel, meanwhile, had leveraged the hearing into even greater credibility and influence. His methodical destruction of Crockett using nothing but documented facts had made him a hero to conservatives who felt that progressive politicians had operated with impunity for too long, never being held accountable for their failures and hypocrisy. But more importantly, his testimony had resonated beyond partisan lines with Americans who were simply tired of politicians who talked a good game but never delivered results, who got rich while claiming to fight for the poor, who ignored their constituents while building national profiles. Patel's approval ratings rose significantly in the weeks following the hearing, and he became one of the more popular figures in the administration despite being a non-political law enforcement official. If this story resonated with you, if you believe that accountability matters regardless of political party, if you think politicians should be held responsible for the gap between their rhetoric and their reality, then I need you to do something right now. Hit that subscribe button, smash the like button, and share this video with everyone who needs to understand that performance politics eventually meets reality. Because what you just witnessed wasn't a partisan attack, it was accountability through facts. Drop a comment telling me which politician you want to see held accountable next, because we're not stopping. This is just the beginning. Subscribe, like, share, and let's demand that our leaders actually live up to the values they claim to represent.